Yes, this is a wonderful opportunity for me to have this webinar moderating, and we have this distinguished professor guest Diego joining from University of Victoria. There is a actually I have a CV. You can see my screen, right? Okay. I believe it is a little bit updated, but I took it from your university website. Now, Diego is an associate editor. He was an associate editor in the Academy of Management, Learning and Education, but we heard that he's going to take over the lead in 2026, and also, he's a professor of entrepreneurship in the Peter Gustafson School in University of Victoria. The research he interested is basically on collective action and social change. His current research is on memory work and strategic uses of the past. I believe there will be more explanation about these terms in the upcoming minutes. And of course, he has many publications in the top journals. And I personally first want to introduce you to the field, the organizational memory field. Um, I really wanted to share it with you, the audience, because this field is one of the reasons that I love my work. I really love reading about memory and history of the organizations. It is so challenging philosophically and makes you think in many different aspects. The temporal perspectives are quite interesting, so I really recommend this field to all the scholars who are now starting their careers. These quotations actually are taken from the works which Diego contributed. And also, sometimes, even when we are dealing with the temporality, we can sometimes find ourselves dealing with the ghosts as well. So, actually, I just picked handpicked some of the recent studies of Diego so that you can have a better idea what he is interested also about the field. This one actually in particular is not really about the organizational memory, but this is quite important, I believe, because um, one of the missions in the Turkish Academy of Management is also try to make a voice and not only deal with the hegemony of the Western knowledge in the management literature. So Diego also contributes to this multinational or global contributions in the management and history as a scholar and as an editor. So this one also is a remarkable study also from them. And also this one year after. This introduced us also to the organizational memory field. I also encourage you to take a look at it. This one actually uh, tells us that it is not only one research dimension, and the research field can be uh, in the organizations and also in the organization field as well. Uh, this quote also, I think, explains too much. The past is not a piece of information attached to a medium, instead, a discursive reality that is reinterpreted and renegotiated in the present. That's the interesting part of the memory studies, actually. This one is the one with the ghosts, actually. There are many type of ghosts, and this is important because we have this new paradigm or new perspective in this contemporary organizational studies, as there is a multi-temporal reality of organizations. The past, present, and the future can intersect to inform the organizational life. Also, if you can take a look. And a last one, a very recent one, I believe this is just 2 months old or something. And this is about trauma and memory because most of the time the strategic use of the past deals with pleasant memories, but there are also memories of violence and trauma. And this is also another interesting field to look at while trying to understand organization life. So basically, Diego's work can be summarized in this, but of course, it's not limited to those. These are some that I just wanted to uh, show or demonstrate to you. As I said, in the organization memory studies, Diego is one of the trailblazers, and now I leave the floor to uh, him. So, Diego, please, whenever you are ready.
Thank you so much, Bora.
You
Yeah,
just,
so,
you know,
so,
yeah,
so first,
stop
first,
sharing. Yeah.
okay. Yeah, hello everyone, and thanks for connecting. I know that if you're in Turkey, it is 9 p.m. So they've got a good time for me. It's 10 a.m. I'm supposed to be fresh, and maybe you not so much. So I do appreciate you taking the time to connect today, and I'm very grateful to Bora and Merv for the invitation to speak here. It's usually the world is not as big as we think now that we have the technology to reach it, and yet I think sometimes we don't feel as connected as we possibly can. So I think these kinds of initiatives that put us in touch with scholars all around the world are very worthwhile. And again, it's a pleasure to be here to share a little bit with you. The work I've been doing in relation to organizational memory studies. Um, so I'm gonna try to share my screen with you. You can let me know whether you can see it or not. Is it working for you?
Yes,
You see the presentation?
perfectly.
Okay, do you have it in presentation mode by any
Yes,
chance?
it is in presentation mode, I believe.
Oh, is it? So I
Mhm.
probably have to switch. Oh no, it's not presenter view,
No, it's
right?
not. No,
No
no,
No,
comments
no,
or
no,
no,
anything.
no, 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 it's
Okay,
not.
yeah,
no.
because I can't see that either.
Mhm.
Okay, good. So, so the invitation I received and the conversation I had was, Merv and Bora told me a little bit about the effort that the Turkish Academy of Management is doing now, and they in particular. To bring a little bit of the scholarship connecting history, memory, and the past, to the members of the international community and the Turkish community. So the idea really is to kind of give an overview of some of the work that has been done in the area, right? So I do intend to present some, a little bit, just a range of some of the work that has been done with, particularly some of the aspects of my research. But I must say, Bora did such a great job already summarizing some of that work that, a part of it is going to be a little bit of a repetition. I'm afraid. One thing I just wanted to emphasize is, so I'm originally from Brazil, right? So English is my second language, as you can see. So if it's easier for you to post questions and engage with us through the chat, please do. It's always great, to be able to have a conversation and not just be here presenting something. Okay. And if it makes it easier, because as as um, as is usually the case, we have different levels of uh, uh, um, fluency and also comfort in speaking another language. I think right now we AI has been facilitating quite a lot the job of translating some of our ideas. So feel free, to engage with us as I move along the presentation. If it's just me here talking, it may be quite a hard thing to follow at 9 p.m. Okay, so please engage with us, and if I'm not being if I'm not monitoring the chat as much as I should, please let me know. Okay. Um, so I want to start talking a little bit about this book, which I've read, and I didn't read as a kid. I wish I did, but it was later in life, and I must say I had the pleasure of reading it in English. Um, but th this book was published in 1899, okay, by Joseph Conrad, and it became quite well known at the time, and turned into a classic because of the story that it tells. So it follows an adventurer who is going through the jungles of Congo to investigate a guy there called Kurtz, okay, who were at the time, or at least in the book, a very charismatic colonial agent who was responsible for managing the ivory trade within the region. Okay? And Joseph Conrad was, celebrated by his story. But some people might not know that it was, he was actually reflecting something that he witnessed himself when traveling through Africa. And basically, what we he saw, even though his work is a work of fiction, was the reality that had been created in the region by King Leopold II from Belgium. Okay? So King Leopold was given when the European powers were splitting Africa. King Leopold came up with a discourse of humanism and free trade, and he was given this a big piece of land in near the Congo River, and he exploited it to the bone using several practices that we would consider, atrocities, not only today, but at that very time. Okay, so those included, several things like, persecution, forced labor, rape, the seasoning of limbs and etc. So everything that was in his power to make people work and explore, to collect ivory, but also rubber and minerals, he used. Okay, and when those atrocities became known, right, they generated a public international outcry, and eventually he had to give away because this was his sort of personal property, and he gave it away to Belgium, so it became the Belgian Congo. But before he did, he ordered all the archives, the national archives at the time, or the state archives, to be burned, right? Apparently, it took 8 days to burn all the archives, okay? Because he didn't want the rest of the world to know of the atrocities he committed. So, and yet his bonfire of archives, would not be enough to actually erase all the people that was left, with severed limbs and all that memory that was not only inscribed in their bodies, but in the whole experience that they had of the exploration or the early capitalism that was arriving at their door. Okay. In 2000, you know, close to the the or in 2020, associated with the movement that developed internationally in connection to the death of George Floyd. You might remember, lots of statues being defaced. Okay. And the same happened in Belgium with King Leopold's statue. Okay? So it was the celebration of the 60th anniversary of the Congo independence, okay? And people were asking, the statues to be removed. Interestingly, this guy died with his reputation very, very low. Okay. But it was, after the First World War, one of his descendants sprinkled some statues here and there in Belgium and contributed to a good legacy story of his deeds in Africa and Congo to be spread in society. So a big divide between the way Belgium or Belgians tend to remember King Leopold and the way, the Congolese people remember what he did. It exists, right? And around 2020, actually, we had, more and more an exposition of his atrocities. So the point here, and you may ask yourselves about this, right? So is where the organizations, involved here. So if you might remember the rubber barons of the 20th century, right? So the car industry was just developing at that time, and much of that industry depended on natural rubber, right? So that was the way the rubber was extracted. But that part of the story is usually not told in relation to King Leopold, right? He also authorized several companies to operate in Congo, to generate or to produce to extract those minerals and the ivory. But those companies tend not to be named, right? And yet, that past, those atrocities that were committed, they were usually associated to the work of organized people under, legally constituted companies in many respects, or at least these companies would benefit from the work that was being developed, right? And those memories eventually tend to vanish, and they are maintained in, not in the state archives, right? But they tend to be maintained by different communities as they pass along, the history and the memory of the suffering that they had in the hands of King Leopold, and of course many other imperial powers, right, that we know operated around the world under the guise of companies such as here in Canada we have the Hudson's Bay Company, there is the VOC or the East India Company, and many other companies that were created in association with imperial powers. Okay? But that's old history, right? And that's usually what we learn, right? Oh, that's the past, right? That's history. So a big reason, and that why I'm interested in memory, and actually on the intersection of past, present, and future, is because memory is not about the past, or not only about the past. Memory tells us more about the present and the future than necessarily about the past, right? The past is more or less what is mobilized, through memory, so we can accomplish things in the present and in the future. Okay. So I've never been to Congo. I've never been to Belgium. And yet, I'm not only familiar, but I may say that this past of the suffering or the imperial, the colonial exploitation is a common past for me. Okay? And if you didn't know the story, okay, now it's a common past for you as well. We not necessarily share the past. We not necessarily have the same views. Okay? But I believe, all of us can point, and say, okay, that past is there and it informs whatever we do in the present and for the future. Okay? So when I look at organizational memory studies, my concern is to look at those intersections. Okay? It's how we eventually conceive and talk about the past in relation to the present and the future. Okay, so as a general outline, I want to give you a little sense of where we came from as a field. Okay, some of the distinctions or differences between history and the memory and how what we have been calling the organizational memory studies field has been constituted. And then I'm going to focus a little bit more on this idea of memory work and the work that takes place within communities and between communities. And then just outline some possibilities for future research. Okay? So I don't see any questions on the chat, so I'm moving forward here. Okay. So just to give you a general sense, okay, um, organizational memory is not a recent term, okay? The idea of organizational memory actually, emerges and develops usually in association with Herbert Simon, Syed March, and what became well known as, studies on learning and, organizational learning and knowledge management, okay? So they talked about memory and they usually treated memory as kind of a box, right? A place where you store knowledge, right? So there are different metaphors for that, but memory bins tend to be the most well used term to reflect that. Memory is just what we keep, the knowledge we keep from the past to the present. That's not, or that's, sounds slightly different from the story I just told you, right? And that has a reason. So the what we can call the renewal, in a way, of the studies on memory. So, the studies on learning and knowledge kind of took off, and people started talking less and less about memory, with the exception of the idea of transactional memory systems, okay, which I will go back later on. Uh, but in 2000s, as part of a growing interest for bringing or connecting history and management as part of what Meyerhold has called a humanistic enterprise, or we need to bring more the humanities to study management. We have been too much associated with the sciences and eventually with sociology, and we need more a humanistic view, right? So at the time in the UK and many other European schools, several historians ended up joining business schools and brought with them that perspective. And so history and interest for the past sort of grew in management. And together with that, the idea or a concern with issues of memory, still pretty much associated with notions of corporate culture or organizational culture, but still elements related to memory, because the historians have been studying that since the 1980s. In 2010, so Roy Sotheby and other colleagues published a very interesting chapter on rhetorical history, and there's a kind of a review of that work that was published in 2023. And the notion of rhetorical history, even though it was connected with this idea of the business history and the humanistic enterprise, it actually came from a different or took a different path towards the same object. It came from studies of rhetoric to understand history as a very interesting discourse about the past, right? So, with a criticism of historians, which tend to see the past as something that happened, something more objective, and their effort as being able to describe as good as possible what happened in the past, so as truthful as possible. The idea of rhetorical history comes to argue that the past and history are two different things. The past can be whatever happened there, but history is just a write-up of the past, which is not necessarily true, right? And historians tend to use several rhetorical devices to make their stories more persuasive, right? In doing so, they are following a tradition, within history itself, which would become known as more a sort of a deconstructive view of history, right? Um, but just because it doesn't assume a correspondence, right, between things that happened in the past and the way we tell the story, right? So it brings this idea that we tell stories or historical narratives, and those historical narratives contribute to construct the reality we see. So departing from the notion of that the reality is a social construction, part of that social construction happens as we construct and reconstruct the past, right? The connection with organization studies comes through the idea of competitive advantage. The argument is that history can be a resource, right? And by managing that resource, we can advantage our companies. So till that time, history was seen as pretty much something that happens and drag us back, right? It's a tradition, it's an obstacle, it generates several reinforcing cycles that keep us doing the same thing over and over instead of innovating. And the perspective of rhetorical history actually channels history or redefines history as a potential resource. As long as we can reinterpret the past, we can use that to leverage our competitive advantage. Okay? So those two developments, contribute to our understanding of organizational memory and to become foundational to organizational memory studies. So at the time, in 2010, the whole idea was to bring memory as something that is different, that is distinct from history, right? So the historians were a big force there, and their perspective is that, history exists and memory exists, and they are two different things. And eventually they conflict because I may investigate the past and find truths there that people have forgotten, right? So I'm going to inform them that their memory is wrong, right? So for history, the past is gone. I need to go there and reconstruct, right? For memory, the past is ongoing, right? It's a living past. And that distinction, stayed for a short while, I must say, within the field, even though it's still there. What happened though is, I would say, we reached a little bit of a level of maturity in our understanding, at least from my perspective, okay, where history and memory, they at the end of the day, they appear as a false dichotomy. Okay. Yes, the historians would say that they are trying to be as truthful as possible. They will rely on archives and they will try to reconstruct the past. Okay. But that doesn't necessarily conflict with the idea of history, right? It may conflict with or with the idea of memory. It may conflict with the memory as is maintained by one specific community, okay? But there's no past without memory. So memory scholars have been, provided or have provided a better understanding of the notion of memory that actually incorporates history. Okay, so from even a historian point of view, the doing of history, the historiography that we do nowadays, okay, is our modern form of memory, is the way we, as modern people understand the past, investigate the past, and eventually tell narratives and stories that then we keep for the future. Okay, so memory, in a very big way, okay, is, in my mind, more fundamental even than the experience of time that we have, right? So we tend to treat time as a given in many respects. Time is objective, and memory happens across time, okay? But if you ask a golden fish, okay, how he experiences time, okay, you may actually get a very different understanding of what time is. Okay, so if you cannot remember more than 1 minute, okay, how would time look like for you? So my understanding is that we are reconceptualizing in a very big way our experience of time, or present, past, and future, right? Based on our understanding of memory, based on what we remember and how we remember. Okay, and that's kind of the flip of the switch, at least for me. So how would I understand memory? For me, the best way is to talk about memory as this socially articulated, okay? It's socially constructed, okay? And socially maintained reality of the past. So the first thing is to accept or to understand that the past is a social construction, okay? And the past, as we talk about that, is not simply what's out there and what is past. Okay, we have futures that are past, we have presents that are past, okay, and we have memories that are about the future as well. Okay, so the memory is not simply, located at the past and disconnected from the present and the future. Memory only exists because it's constructed, it's built like it is in the present for the future, right? If memory wasn't didn't have any relevance for the present, okay, it wouldn't be maintained. Okay, so the reason why we maintain, the reason why we construct and reconstruct memory is because it's relevant for today and tomorrow. Okay. Okay, so once those understandings kind of settled in the field, I think we can talk a little bit more about the idea of organizational memory studies. So if we had the notion of organizational memory, which usually was, kind of the memory bins that organizations use to store knowledge, when these notions of rhetorical history and this idea that memory is, socially constructed and is the reality of the past that is continuously reproduced, okay, came up, we redefined the field to look, instead of organizational memory, right, studies that look at organizational memory, to focus on memory studies from an organizational perspective. Okay? And that really changes the approach, because if we look at studies on organizational memory, okay, our focus is on how organizations remember. But social remember, doesn't happen only in organizations. Organizations are a big part of it, right? So we prefer to look at memory studies, which is a bigger field of studies that involve, how memory is constructed and reconstructed in different dimensions of society from an organizational angle, right? So organizations contribute to the way memory is socially constructed from this perspective, okay? So the focus here is really to try to understand how the memory work that takes place in organizations and through organizations, okay, shapes that reality of the past. Okay, I see we have a question here. Have you considered how ecologies of memories interact with the garbage can model of organizational choice? Not really, but that sounds quite exciting. Okay? Uh, I'm familiar with the garbage can model, okay? And I'd be quite interested in learning more what you have in mind with this with this connection. Okay, so maybe how memories are actually part of that garbage that goes in the air, to produce something else. Okay, but we can go back to that later on. So please keep posting questions. That's a good one. Okay, so if we were to, parse out the existing traditions in the field, okay, and this is what we did in that piece for the annals, and I would, I must confide to you that the reviewers actually pushed us, to make a clear distinction between what is psychological and what is sociological. In reality, things are not so clear cut, okay? But I would say at least the psychological tradition in management, okay, was much more clear cut. And they don't usually consider themselves as heirs of Frederick Bartlett, okay? But Frederick Bartlett was actually a psychologist who liked Halbach's work and decided to write or contribute to that tradition. But he had a slightly different understanding of what memory looked like. Okay? So he was interested in understanding how individuals remember. So Jeffrey Ollick, a sociologist, he came up with this concept of collected memory, right? So the idea or the perspective from Bartlett's point of view was much more an idea of the past as shared. So looking at individuals and how their shared understanding of the past is constructed, right? So that was the whole notion. If you could, pick the brains of different people and see how they understand the past, you would have a sense of the collected memory, right? He would call collective memory, but this idea of collected memory and the notion of addition or superimposition of memories kind of gives a better sense of how that works, right? So different individuals pasted on one on top of the other gives you a sense of what they share, the understanding they share about the past. Within management, the focus has been pretty much on the content and on a repository view of memory, right? So the memory is that knowledge that is passed from the past to the future. A more sociological tradition, uh, which is inaugurated by Maurice Halbach, uh, was developed because he was dissatisfied with the psychological explanations at the time. So he was a student of Durkheim, and he comes, with that structuralist perspective, and he applies that to memory. So he's not concerned with the individual and what the individual remembers, because Halbach's understanding is that individuals only remember as members of communities. So as long as I understand what communities define as the past and what from the past is important and must be remembered, I will understand what individuals remember. Because the communities provide frameworks of memory, frameworks of remembering that establish what individuals should remember about the past and what they should forget, right? So he moves away from that idea of, different individuals patched together to understand the shared past to what I would define as this common past. They all recognize a common past, even though they might have different views and perceptions about that. But that common past is what should be remembered, right? That's what the framework of remembering of the community they belong to tells them that they should know about. Okay. So, as many of you would know, for instance, if we ask about uh, you know, specific events in history, right? So, why did specific wars started, etc. We would have some points of reference, within that history that is collectively remembered, right? So some of the studies that were developed in that regard, for example, have looked at generations at the pre Second World War. Oh, sorry, generations right after the Second World War, and asked them about Napoleon and Hitler, right? and they would report them as two different folks. Okay. Later generations, when they were asked about these two leaders, okay, they would say that both of them died through the same wrong strategy, right? So they would overlap or would see them and pack them together into a one kind of a, one leader with the same strategy. Well, both of them, divided forces, invaded Russia, and died in the winter. Right. So, but that interpretation did not exist right after the Second World War, right? So it evolved collectively as a general understanding that nowadays we sort of reproduce. Okay. So in that sense, okay, but everybody would recognize, the Russian campaign from Napoleon and Hitler, right? Because most of us, were inculcated that part of the story, which becomes part of our common past. Okay, so in a way, again, history and memory are not so divided, right? And history also contributes, to construct the memory or the global memory we have in this case. Okay? So when we compare these two traditions, so we used two different terms. Okay, we were trying to analyze how the scholarship is developing those two traditions. So we looked for the 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 keyword organizational memory, okay, which is the dotted line there, and we saw that there was some initial work that was developed that much earlier than the idea of collective memory, for instance, right? And it sort of stabilizes over time, right? So if we look at the cumulative works, we have much more work on organizational memory, but that over time is kind of gets stable, while collective memory more recently associated with this sociological tradition kind of is picking up, right? And that's the reason I would assume I'm here today. Okay. So that's what we found. So there are different ways we can study memory in organizations. Okay, the more functional approach, as memory is retention bins and knowledge has been associated with the work on transactive memory systems, for example. So whenever we say that losing employees is to lose knowledge, we're kind of connecting with that tradition that implies that employees are the keepers of the organizational knowledge or organizational memory. So we need to find ways of maintaining or keeping them in, so that memory, which might be functional, might be important for the way we do our operations, is maintained. Okay. There is another approach which takes a more interpretive sort of perspective that tends to look at memory as a collection of narratives, right? So the way the organization is talked into being, if you want, right? So we talk about the past, and in talking about the past, we create these interpretations that then define that reality. So when we look at the myth of the garage, right? That tends to be quite dominant in the Silicon Valley, for instance, right? Every single new entrepreneur there will try to spend at least, a couple of weeks working at the garage so they can later on claim, that, hey, we started at my dad's garage, we did this, or that, because that became such an important point of reference to say, okay, so many tech companies started at the garage and then became so huge that we're starting there too, because there's something to do with the garage that we still don't understand, but that's an important part of the story, right? So the way we construct that past and we create interpretations of it, actually give an order to the story and transmit some important meanings for our audiences, right? So shaping those interpretations is an important work that we might have to do as an organization or as an entrepreneur. Okay. A more critical perspective, don't take such a clear side in terms of how the past is constructed, right? Don't pay so much attention, for instance, to the rhetorical history that entrepreneurs use, right? Or the way they reassemble their memories to convince an audience that they have something important to say. But we'll look at the past actually as a site of struggle, right? And we'll pay more attention to the different communities and the claims that they have about the past and how those claims might eventually contradict and conflict with one another, paying attention, for instance, to issues of power, right? So when, again, I mentioned I come from Brazil, we have a big legacy of dictatorship in Brazil. And when we had our Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right, many of the military people who were basically reincorporated in society after we became a democracy, went public saying that so the archives after that were closed for 50 years, right? So they were reopened a few years back. And when they were reopened and scholars started studying to see what really happened, these people went, crazy. They really didn't like that, and they went public to say that that was an absurd. That we shouldn't actually be disclosing the names and the atrocities that were committed, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But that was the path that the country took in terms of reconciliation, right? So 50 years closed, but they continue to live in society. So retelling that past from the perspective of the victims, for instance, became a big issue and a center of debate within the Brazilian society, with the impacts, including in our politics and the elections, associated with it. The fourth approach, okay, is takes a more performative understanding of memory, right? So memory is not so much about discourses or stories about the past or those conflicts, but memory is what is created, in the past, is presentified. Okay, it's made present through our actions and the way we engage with that past. Okay, so the example I usually use, okay, it's like the nativity scene or the nativity reenactment, but I didn't know how many of you would be familiar with that idea, from the Catholicism, right? But it's kind of the reenactment of the birth of Jesus, right? But when we look at corporate anniversaries, right, we have something similar, right? Is the commemoration is kind of the reenacting and retelling of that story, and that is the moment when the past is made present, right? So it takes shape in the present, right, as a present accomplishment. So the past doesn't exist out there. It only exists as it is performed into being the past. Okay, so it's a slightly different approach, and I'm not going to get into the details of each of these approaches, but we do have different ways that we can understand memory and we can approach memory in organization studies. Any questions so far? Okay, we do have something else here. Okay. Yes. So, thank you, Ibru. We do have a connection with institutional theory, right? So, I would say that connection hasn't been so much developed yet. You would find a paper from Willie Ocasio looking at the connection between institutions and memory at AMR in 2012, I believe. And there is the one I referred before, Sotheby et al. 2023 in Journal of Management Studies also builds some connection there. There are other bits and pieces, but I wouldn't say it's hasn't it has been very well developed so far. So there's a lot that can still can be done in that respect. And since you're familiar with institutional theory, you might as well be familiar with social symbolic theory. So in one way, memory work is not part of the initial list of forms of work that they list, but you might as well understand memory work as a form of social symbolic work. Okay, that or in association with the idea of temporal work, for instance. Okay, hope that helps. So, what are we talking about when we talk about memory work? Okay, so the most the key concern that we have when we talk about memory work is not necessarily the work of one single individual, right? But it's how individuals within communities engage in different forms of memory work, and more importantly, I would say how these communities, which are also organizations, engage in different forms of memory work. Okay, so the notion of mnemonic communities is helpful. Okay, because we define a mnemonic community as a community that is constituted by the past. Okay, which means that the past is an important part of the way a community generates or constructs its own identity. Not only a resource, but something that binds that community together. So whenever we talk about an organization, you usually join an organization that already exists, that already has a set of memories, and you're socialized into those memories and belong or become part of that community, right? Of that organization, right? So there's a whole process of socialization, right, which is a form of memory work that takes into it and makes you a member of that community. Okay, different ways or different forms of communities emerge. Some of them, and I'll mention this a little bit later on, but some communities emerge when a new technology is developed. Some communities emerge out of, a community of practice that eventually, after so many years, start to cultivate the memory of the community and becomes bound by that memory. So there are different forms that communities associated with a place, right? So I do research on indigenous peoples, as Bora mentioned, right? Indigenous peoples have a close association with place, for instance, to the extent that their memories are distributed in a specific place. So the place, is an important part of the way they remember, right? So the communities, even place communities as they are called, they might be mnemonic communities. Uh, one of the important points that important arguments, at least in my opinion, that we have been developing is this idea that we shouldn't look at organizations as centers of memory or exclusively pay attention to organizational memory. So the argument Halbach's develops is the idea that individuals only remember within the context of the communities they belong to. My argument is that we can do, or we can use a similar argument to organizations. So organizations and organizational memory, cannot be really understood only looking at the idiosyncrasies of one specific organization. Most of the time, what organizations do and the way they remember is associated with the communities that these organizations belong to. Okay, so we can see organizations involved in different networks, or as institutional theory would have it, institutional fields, right, or organizational fields, whereas the field kind of creates and establishes the frameworks of memory that those organizations would use, right? So not only organizations as corporations, but we can think about occupational communities. We can think about racial communities, religious communities. All of them will have their organizations within those fields, and they will have similar ways of remembering. Okay? So when thinking about mnemonic work as kind of this overarching, umbrella term, what really we're concerned is the kind of practices that both individuals, groups, and organizations engage into in order to construct and reconstruct and sometimes even destroy that reality of the past. Okay, so those mnemonic practices can take place, within one single community. So if I'm interested in understanding what one specific organization is doing, okay, I don't know, Panasonic or Disney, I can go there and try to understand what are the practices of memory that that specific community engages into, right? And yet, there are some practices that take place between communities, right? So, an organization which is embedded in one specific community, right, will eventually cater to that community and develop, different forms of relationship and different practices of remembering, connecting them to that community. So, if you're a hospital, engaging with different occupational communities such as nurses, physicians, etc., right? You will have several practices of memory that you share with other hospitals, okay, within the same field, right? But you're also going to have different forms of memory, different practices of memory that you will develop in relation to those occupational communities, such as physicians and nurses. So understanding how these communities eventually get together and engage in practices both separately and in connection is important within the idea of memory work. Okay. I see a question from Rosella. When conducting a study grounded, oh, just wait, I can bring the screen here. Okay. In OMS, would it be advisable to explicitly clarify which of the four approaches the study reflects? I think so. I don't think I've seen, much clarity on that. Okay. In terms of people clearly expressing that they are embracing one perspective of memory. The challenge might be to remain consistent across your paper, right? So you don't necessarily need to be, very explicit as long as you maintain that consistency. So if you're treating, if you're embracing a more interpretive view of memory, and throughout your paper, you're only talking about memory as a repository of information, that would be problematic. Okay, so as long as you maintain the consistency, I think you would be mostly good. And I think there is some overlaps across some of those perspectives as well. So it might not be as easy as we may think to say, okay, this is the box I fit in. Okay, I tend not to like boxes that much. They are helpful as interpretive devices, but when you try to fit into the box, you're gonna miss maybe some important elements, or you might miss some important elements to your story. So moving forward, what we did. Oh, Merv.
Yeah, I want to ask something about that perspectives because sometimes interpretative and critical perspective is intertwined with each other, and I cannot tell if it is critical point or interpretative. And another question about performative. What do you think about the relational approach of because they have the same thing, materialization and reenactment, as you tell. I found some similarity and parallel structures. What do you think about it?
Thank you. Those are great questions. So in relation to the first one, I would say, if so interpretive and critical do have, overlaps. Um, the way I would think of them is more to the ends of uh, kind of more paradigmatic approaches, right? If you're taking kind of a, embracing a more critical paradigm, whatever that is, if you're just post-structuralism or if you're kind of a deconstructivist, that should kind of set the understanding of the direction, and they would go beyond just the social construction of whatever is there, right? So I would say most of the time, okay, if you're embracing a critical approach, interpretation is an assumed understanding within the perspective you're taking, right? But within the interpretive approach, you're just not necessarily concerned too much with issues of power and dominance as you are or you may be when taking a critical approach. Okay, so I do see, as I said, there are overlaps there, but if you take a more paradigmatic instance in the way you see that world, I think it makes it easier for you to say, okay, this is how I'm gonna treat my data and eventually tell my story instead of staying in this direction, right? Which actually brings me to your next question, which is great. So, for me, the performative is relational. Okay, so there's no performance or performativity without the other in that sense, right? So it is constructed in relation to the others. That doesn't necessarily forbids you from taking a relational ontology when using an interpretive epistemology, for instance, right? So I would say as long as you understand that, the past might not be just an interpretation, but the past takes shape as you enact it and as you perform it, that for me would be the key main distinction. And we don't have that many papers that have actually talked about, or have taken a more performative approach. So the one that comes to mind, oh,
Maybe we will speak about it. We are
I
working
hope
on it.
so. Yeah, so the one that comes to mind is Ferogi 2025, where they looked at the technologies that DJs use and how important old technologies are, for them to signal that they are members of that community, right? So in a way, it's by performing, the actions that how people used to do in the past, okay, and that they show their identity or that they have their identities recognized by the community, right? So that past is not there, right? Those memories don't belong there. It's the actualization through enactment of those memories that allow them to embrace their identities. But again, doing that kind of work is not that easy, right? So that's also that aspect of it. To look at the performativity as it happens might not be as so easy as looking at memory bins, for instance. Okay, cool. Okay, so just to introduce this to us, one of the things we did when writing that review for the annals was to look at the different forms of memory work, or trying to understand from the previous literature what kind of practices have we been studying, right? And trying to summarize some of those practices. So within communities, we noticed that these three main blocks of work that individuals and organizations engage into, right? So remembering, representing, and forgetting. Okay. So in addition to what would be named kind of natural forgetting, time erases everything and those kinds of sayings, right? We do have intentional forgetting, and several organizations do that by discarding, information that they don't need anymore, by eventually suppressing or eliminating things that might not be, paint them in good pictures, and disconnecting or dissociating themselves from events that may not represent whatever they think about themselves, right? We saw remembering as efforts to avoid, that natural process of forgetting. Okay, and we were able to identify these forms of storying, right? So developing narratives about the past, eventually preserving the past in a more material forms of the past, preserving documents, records, objects, and etc. And including routines and other practices, and also commemorating as an important practice that again presentifies the past, right? So turns or brings to the present elements that are considered important from the past. Okay. And so apart from the traditional remembering and forgetting, we also looked into representing. And the easiest way to understand this is, in association with the idea of rhetorical history, which is really, focusing on the more content side of how organizations, talk or construct that past. So how they historicize the past, how they curate elements from the past in order to, shape it, and how they reenact that past in order to materialize it. But these practices of representation, the main difference is that they tend to be made for others, right? So they are developed within the organization, but they are not necessarily made for the organization itself, but for others, which can be the stakeholders, right? But they are internal practices. So some of the primary studies we had in this respect were studies connecting memory to identity. Okay, and they are still some of the most well cited. So Charlotte Lind was looking at an insurance company, and she realized that when the company was engaging in organizational change, a big part of that organizational change involved narrating the past or telling different stories about the past that justified and legitimized what the organization was doing. So remembering those elements actually helped the organization move forward and make the changes which were necessary. Schultz and Hernandez were looking at Lego, and they realized that well, at some point in 2000s, the organization was sort of stuck, and they needed to, they wanted to make changes, and they got a consulting company working with them. They looked back, they realized, okay, we're a block company, tried to make changes to improve their products and their revenue, and didn't go anywhere. They hired another consulting group, okay, that helped them to look much deeper in the past, even before the blogs were born, and they realized that they were a company that produced toys, and toys of the best quality. And that kind of generated an insight within the organization that allowed them to move away or move beyond the blocks to actually develop several forms of innovation, right? I have my kids here who love, the Lego cartoons, or, kind of the movies and etc., right? So different range of products that are associated with the idea of toys, and they are ludic. Um, Another one well known is the Antabi and Molnar piece on Snecna, which is kind of the French airline company. And how the company at some point needed some help from engineers from outside of France, right? And they hired several non-French engineers. But in order to tell the story, they were a national company, right? To tell the story of how they were successful, they would minimize the role and emphasize the Frenchness of the company, right, as it was associated with a with the national aspect, right? So that was an element of purposefully forgetting those players, right, to emphasize what was interesting for the company at that point in time. Okay, so we do have these different practices that take place within organizations, right, and some literature that has been only expanding to that regard. So in addition to the within communities, we also had the between community several within communities several practices of memory, right, that take place. So um, again, looking at an organization, just as a single whole, a single community, we can talk about those within practices. And yet, if we, put a magnifying glass there, we're going to see that an organization is constituted by different groups, right? And those different groups are also, in some aspects, communities of memory themselves, or, so if we look at I don't know, the law group within a firm, okay, they are a small mnemonic community which has boundaries that are not only that don't belong only to that organization, right? But they share boundaries with the lawyers as a broader, or as as an occupational community as well. So they belong as a group to these two different mnemonic communities, right? So we started paying attention to the research that has looked into the practices that take place between these communities. Okay, so what we found was that, between communities, there are several other practices that involve elements of power and some forms of domination and negotiation that we tend not to see if we just think about the organization as a whole, right? So similar to the research on organizational culture, when we look at the organizations as cultures, right, as a single dominant culture, we don't actually see that there are many different subcultures within the organization. So in the same sense, or in a similar sense, we can talk about internal communities, right, or internal mnemonic communities, external mnemonic communities. So we mapped several practices, right, that of memory that these communities engage into, okay, and these three major forms of memory work, where one community sort of imposes their understanding and that. The way they see the past over other community, okay, the work of resisting that imposition, and eventually when the communities might be in the same sort of place, they might be able to negotiate some aspects of that reality of the past. Okay, so I did some research on tobacco companies, okay, and how tobacco companies in the US, the big tobacco, was able to maintain the fallacy that tobacco products don't cause cancer or are not harmful um, for about 50 years. Okay, uh, so basically by creating a campaign of misinformation. Christina Lubinsky did some research looking at German companies operating in India, and how the Indians actually resisted part of the the colonial perspectives that those companies were bringing by arguing that they were the true real Aryans, right? So changing the script of the story. And Judith Shrimp Sterling, who passed away very recently, has looked at Volkswagen and how the legacy of collaboration with the Nazis was negotiated by the company in relation to the community by opening up their archives and having people, having historians looking at that past. Okay, so we mapped, these two broad sets of memory work taking place within and between communities to kind of create a platform for people to do more research on organizational memory studies. More recently, okay, my interest has been moving me slightly away from organizations themselves to pay more attention to those to the broader set of stakeholders that organizations engage with and the communities where they are embedded, right? So I've been interested in issues of organizational violence and injustice and trauma. Okay? And the most recent piece that Bora mentioned, in that piece, I tried to start a conversation connecting, the organizational violence with issues of memory and trauma. And the main argument in that paper, right, in a previous paper with Jordi Vives, we talked about the legacies of irresponsibility. So companies do bad things in the past, and that's a legacy they need to carry on. But when we look from the point of view of a community, okay, they're not worried about the irresponsibility per se. What that creates for them, or what they make out of that violence that they experience, I'm calling a legacy of trauma. Okay, so I'm distinguishing the experience of violence from trauma itself. Okay, because for me, trauma is basically the judgment of value of that experienced violence, right? So I may be subjected to violence, but I realized that I was able to shake that off and move on because I'm a strong person and that's the way it works. Okay, so I wouldn't talk about trauma when talking about myself and what I experienced. Okay, I might have may have experienced violence, uh, but I endured. The moment I start talking about trauma is when that involves some form of a political project. Okay, and trauma only appears more recently in the late modernity because it's a recognized discourse that distinguishes clearly who is a victim and who is a perpetrator. Okay, and the moment I do that, that generates a responsibility for the perpetrator in relation to the victims. So, as a victim community, okay, I describe or I construct or reconstruct the past as a past of trauma, okay, because that eventually becomes an important resource in the way I engage with that past and with the communities that developed the violence. The moment I do that, it becomes so important for my own identity as a community, right? I'm constituted by that trauma that letting go of the trauma in a big way means letting go of who I am as a group or as a community. And that will eventually cause troubles for healing. Okay? So we have several indigenous communities, for example, in Canada, that experienced residential schools, which were, they were taken when they were kids and taken to these schools ruled by priests, and they could hardly ever visit their families until they, finish up their studies, and they would go home as an attempt at, inculcating the Western views and making them members of the society. So now this became a major issue of intergenerational trauma, and they have been mobilizing that as a very important discourse, in order to acquire self-determination, right? So there are reparations that need to be provided for them because of their experience there. The difficulty, though, is the moment those memories are created and established, they are passed along to future generations of survivors. And together with those memories, there's a moral imperative that they should not forget. It's their responsibility to remember. Okay? And yet, if you're always remembering and reenacting that pain, okay, that continues with you. So the future generations take the responsibility not only of remembering the past, but also, re-engaging in one form or another with the same pain and passing it along. Okay? And so that's kind of one of the issues I'm working on right now. So I know I'm very beyond, the time I was supposed to present. I'm just gonna leave the last slide here. But my hope is that this is a start in, the start of a conversation instead of just a simple presentation. Okay, but there are several different possibilities for future research that I hope some of you may be interested in engaging with. And yeah, I'd be happy to talk more about this at some other point in time.
Well, thank you, Diego. It was really astonishing. And actually, just there was a question about trauma while we already talked about, so maybe I can read it to you. Your work on organizational memory, violence, and trauma is very